Another dreary day. The perfect time for some stories with friends. Hello everyone, it's me, Dr. Plague, and welcome back to more cozy horror. We're up to 3 times a week now, and I couldn't be happier. I really love these cozy little stories and this nice time with you, my friends. So, let's kick this off right, shall we? In this dangerous world, it's important to protect what's yours, especially if you've got man's best friend by your side. So, let's have a look at what happens when some burglars encounter the signs that they should beware of dog. Should have been an easy score. Rob an old man, leave without much fuss. We never could have guessed how south it would go. Everyone had heard of Duncan Adams. He'd been a fixture in the community for generations, living in that wild old house up on Mount Yaller. He'd been a writer, a professor of antiquities at Georgia State College, and any number of other things. His house was supposed to contain all sorts of expensive things, and we were going to see if the rumors were true. Mike didn't like it, though. Guy like that is certain to have all sorts of security, the best measures money can buy, and you just expect the 4 of us to walk in like it's nothing. Julius, Gavin, Mike, and I like to call ourselves a crew, but that was just from watching too many heist movies. In reality, we were just 4 guys who like to break into people's houses and steal things. We weren't druggies, we weren't criminals, despite what our records said. But we did like to buy nice things, and stealing often paid for them better than a real job. You'd think so, I said, but my brother went up there to do a job and said that there were no security systems, no cameras, no nothing. The dude is just asking to get robbed, and I say we take him up on it. My youngest brother's a plumber, and that was actually where I got the idea for the job. He got called about a month ago to fix some pipes in the old man's bathroom, and came back to tell us how cool the place was. He had all these mirrors on the grounds, and in the house, and on the walls, and it was like a fun house. It was really cool looking, he said. The old man had paid him a mint to do the job, and I'd spent the next 3 weeks thinking about that house, and planning the biggest heist that I could imagine. The plan is that we go in just after dark and jump the sidewall. We can go in through the garden out back, and come out on the back porch and into the house. The old man's a hard sleeper. My brother said he had to ring the bell a dozen times before he woke up. We can go in and out before he even knows we're there, and live like fat rats off the spoils. Mike still wasn't sure, but greed was slowly eroding his sense of self-preservation. He said he would bring it to a vote with the rest of the crew, and later that afternoon he called to say that the vote had been carried unanimously. The other 2 were in, and Mike wasn't about to hold us up with some tickling feeling of doubt. Hope your intel's right, because if you're not, we're all going to be royally screwed. And that was how we came to be hunkered in the scrub around the Duncan Adams estate, waiting for it to get good and dark. We were all dressed in dark clothes, Jules and Gavin wearing ski masks, while Mike and I just had our hoods pulled up. I was pretty sure that we wouldn't need cover, but Jules had 2 prior arrests, and Gavin was clean for the moment. Both wanted to stay out of prison, if they could help it, and had opted to cover their faces. As the dark began to settle around us, we kept to the fence and prepared to vault over. It was just a simple concrete wall, no lights or cameras on the top. But Mike stopped before making a stirrup with his hands to point at a sign on the wall. You didn't say nothing about a dog. I looked at the sign, wrinkled my brow as I tried to remember if Lewis had mentioned a dog. He hadn't. He'd said nothing about any kind of animals on the property, but a dog could complicate things. The sign was the usual black and yellow one that bore the legend, "Beware of dog," on it, but it looked a little faded, and I suddenly wondered if it was something from a while ago. It's probably old. Lewis didn't say anything about a dog or a cat or anything to do with animals. Mike seemed unsure, but I doubled down. Tell you what, I'll go first and drop behind the gate. If there's a dog, it'll just tear me up, and I'll find some way to get out, or you guys can run. We'll only be out for the gas it took to get us here, and I'll have spent a night in jail, worst case scenario." Mike still looked unsure, but he made a stirrup with his hands, and I vaulted over the wall and landed in a well-kept backyard. It had been landscaped to look oriental, maybe Japanese or something, and there was a bridge over a little creek and a well-cared-for walkway that led to the back of the house. There was a sand pit with rocks in it, some trees cut to resemble bonsai trees, and several large reflective columns interspaced around. It was definitely different, but I liked it the longer I stood waiting to get mauled by a Rottweiler or a pit bull. "What do you see?" Mike whispered, as I scanned the area for a slobbering beast that was just waiting to strike. "Nothing. Well, not nothing, but no dog. Come on over. I think it's safe." They dropped over one at a time, Mike reaching back to pull Gavin over before landing himself. They all stared at the strange little garden, so alien in the twilight, and when no lights came on to mark them, and no dog came out to chase us away, we all sighed collectively. "Looks like there wasn't a dog after all," Julia said. "Or he's inside," Mike said skeptically. "Whatever. Cross that bridge when we come to it. We gotta get inside first," I reminded them, as we set off across the little garden path. It was a little eerie to walk across the shadowy garden, with only the moon to guide us. The place seemed to be made of strange angles, and the reflective monoliths didn't help matters much. They were everywhere, a new one jutting up every 7 or 8 feet, and they played strange games in the moonlight. I would catch myself looking at them out of the corner of my eye, and more than once I had to turn and make sure something wasn't following us. The reflections created strange shadows, and I was sure I saw something dart out of sight before turning to find nothing and nowhere that it could have gone. "These things are weird," Julia said, keeping his voice pitched low. "I could swear I keep seeing something in them, but it's gone when I look." "Me too," Gavin said, sounding a little unnerved. "Eyes on the prize, boys," I reminded them, but I didn't sound as sure as I tried to convey. The backyard hadn't looked very big, but as we moved towards the house, it seemed to go on forever. We were staying low, trying not to draw attention to ourselves, but it seemed like we should have been there by now. Whenever I looked at the back porch, it always seemed to be about 50 feet away, and every step seemed to bring us no closer. "What the hell was that?" Gavin asked, and his voice was too high. Julia shushed him, whispering back, "What are you talking about?" "There it was again, right there, I saw it," Gavin said, pointing at one of the polished monoliths. I glanced at it, but it was just a flat reflection of the weird trees sitting on the back wall. "There's nothing there, Gav. Get it together, man. In a few hours we'll be leaving with more loot than we can carry. Then you can freak out if you still want to." Gavin looked unsure, but he nodded and kept pace as we made our way through the collection of old trees and topiaries. He wasn't the only one getting a little nervous, though. I could see something in those reflections, too. Something I was beginning to think might be our dog. It was big, way too big to go vanishing like it always seemed to. It was a mastiff or a wolf hybrid or something, and the longer we trekked through the garden, the closer it seemed to get to us. At first it was just curiously observing us, seeing what we were doing, and enjoying its little game of startling us. As we neared the house, though, the game changed. Now it was getting closer to our group, weaving between the statues and plants, getting bigger as it stalked us. I still wasn't sure how it was doing that. The thing had to be nearly 5 feet tall on all fours, but it would disappear any time I turned to look behind me. I wondered if there was some sort of electrical gadget in these things, maybe a display mount to scare intruders, but when I looked right at the polished mirror front, I saw nothing but my own reflection, and the larger-than-usual bonsai topiary behind me. I'd like to tell you that we made it to the house before things went sideways. But that's not true. Truth was, we never even saw the inside of the house. We came within about 10 feet of the back porch, a trip that seemed to take longer than it should have, when the purpose of the monoliths became apparent. We were hunched around some of the oddities of the garden, trying to get our nerve up before heading in. Gavin and I weren't the only ones that had been seeing things out of the corner of our eyes, and nerves were high as the goal came into view. Now the real work would begin, but we weren't sure what to expect from this funhouse garden. Would we be allowed to make it to the house? Would we be mowed down by some huge hound on our way to the porch? I didn't know, but suddenly, this didn't seem like the easy score I had promised them. "Jules," I whispered, "go see if the back door is unlocked." "Why have I got to do it?" Jules asked, his nerves jangling a little. "'Cause you're the closest to the door. Just get up there and see." Jules looked at the house like it was the absolute last place he wanted to go. But greed still had its teeth in him. We could still make something of this, still come out okay. And he scampered up the porch steps with all the stealth he could muster. The doors were glass, fronting on a huge glassed-in kitchen, and when Jules reached out for the handle, he seemed as shocked as we were when it pulled down easily. Damn, guy's not even... But as he took his eyes off the glass, I saw something loom up behind him, something that made me tremble. It was the dog, a huge black hellhound with a gaping maw full of sharp teeth and piercing red eyes. It was behind the glass, and I thought for sure that it would jump through and bury Jules with its bulk. I started to yell, started to warn him, but when it leaned out of the glass and snapped its teeth around him, I was surprised by the lack of a crash. Jules looked surprised too, his shock absolute, and when the creature yanked him into the glass and out of sight, we were left in stunned silence, with only the crickets for company. "What the hell was that?" Gavin said, his voice trembling audibly. "I don't know," Mike said, his voice inches behind me as he inched away with every breath. "But I'm not sticking around to find out." He was off and running then, tearing back towards the wall we'd come over. He looked scared enough to jump it without any help, and when I called for him to stop, I winced as a light came on in the house. Great, we'd woken up the old man. Gavin saw the light and took a few steps back himself, but when Mike screamed suddenly, Gavin and I froze as we turned back to see what had happened. In the fleeting rays of the porch light, I saw Mike caught beneath the massive paws. It was coming from the surface of a polished square, and as the head emerged, the beast looked as big as a grizzly bear. The fur was wiry and stiff, something I believe they called brindled in the dog world, and its muzzle was already dripping with blood. It bent down over Mike, the poor guy screaming and thrashing as much as his smushed lungs would allow, and when it covered his head with its mouth, the crying and yelling was cut off abruptly. It took Mike's head with it, but was nice enough to leave the body behind as it disappeared into the polished surface of the brooding rectangle. Gavin and I just stood there for a minute, unsure of what to do. When the door to the back porch opened, we both got low as we tried to hide from whoever had come to check on the ruckus. "Who's there?" said a voice that had probably once been a little more impressive. Age had done it no favors, and now it was a little less impressive, a little less commanding. But the owner seemed to know that he wasn't the most dangerous creature in the garden. The sound of a cane thumping on the boards could be heard, and when he saw the body, he croaked out a rough laugh. "Decided to come and steal from an old man, huh? You didn't think you were the first, did ya?" I looked at Gavin as we hid, trying to tell him to be still, though he seemed to be losing that particular fight. More than a few people have thought that they could come and plunder what I've rightfully taken in my prime. They see an old man living alone and think to make his home their find of the century. They never guess that the most dangerous thing here might be my own biggest find." As we watched, the old man put out a hand, and the hellish beast stuck its nose out of the window it had sucked jewels into, so the old man could scratch it like any other dog. "I was excavating a tomb in Russia when I found them. These strange black monoliths were just in a cave towards the back of the old tomb. I had never seen anything like them or the beast they held, but it had enough intelligence to understand me when I made it an offer. Didn't seem to be enough that he was going to kill us. The old codger meant to monologue before his hell beast devoured us. 'Come back to my home,' I said. 'Come into the lighted world again, and I will take you from this place and let you hunt my enemies for me.' And so I have. It has hunted a long time on would-be thieves and robbers, and eaten well in the process. You will be no different." Gavin looked at the back wall, a path that would take him over the unmoving corpse of Mike, and seemed to be trying to decide if it was worth the risk. I shook my head at him, trying to tell him not to, but when he suddenly sprinted across the lawn, I found myself right behind him. I could no more stop myself from fleeing in my terror than he could, and we dodged around the monoliths at every opportunity. The hound lunged at us nonetheless, coming out of either side as it tried to stop us. We were neck and neck, nearly to the wall, when Gavin suddenly tripped. I looked back and found that Gavin's foot was stuck in a trap too devilish to escape. The creature had him by the ankle, and as it dragged him backwards, I sprinted for the wall and leapt at the top. My fingers burned as they tried to dig into the concrete, and I'm not ashamed to say that I left a few fingernails behind as I scrambled over the top. I drove home, expecting that the creature or the police would come after me every mile of the way. When it didn't come lunging out of my rearview mirror and no blue and whites dogged my heels, I breathed a sigh of relief. I drove home, locked all the doors in my trailer, and went to my room so I could write this down while it's still fresh. Now that I have, I'm not sure what to do. Do I call the police? What would I even tell them? Can that thing get me through my own mirror? My computer monitor? The surface of my spoons? I don't know what to do. But I do know one thing. If you ever hear of Duncan Adams and his strange house in the mountains, and think that an old man living alone will be an easy score, think again. The dog that he has can't be bribed with treats and pets, and all you'll have from that place is death for you and anyone who comes along with you. I tell you, there's nothing I love more than having a good cup of coffee and listening to the rain come down while I think over some of my very favorite stories. The ability to share them with you makes it even better. So, let's roll right in with our next story. This one's about a common problem for dog owners. Dogs get old. Maybe they do something they shouldn't, and they have to be sent elsewhere. This is a story about someone who finds a dog after they've been sent out to pasture. I knew there was no way I could have seen him, but I could swear I saw my old dog, Blue, standing near the fence of Sanders' farm. I work out of town, the town I grew up in being pretty tiny, and I have to pass Sanders' farm anytime I come home from work. Sanders' farm has been a landmark since before I was born, and it grows most of the produce for town. Herschel Sanders runs a very successful produce stand in town, and sells crops to grocery stores all over the state. He's a bit of a local celebrity, and he seems to be the only person in town doing well for himself, besides Cotton's Antiques. He also owned the farm my parents were supposed to have dropped Blue off to when I was a kid. Blue had been a good dog, a great companion for a kid my age. but maybe a little too rambunctious for my parents' liking. He'd been a mutt with pointy ears, a thick coat of soft brown fur, and a pair of green, inquisitive eyes that never seemed to get tired of darting around for something to chase or catch. I loved him, but for two adults in a small house, we lived in an apartment at the time, he must have been a nightmare. The day he bit Tommy was probably one of the worst days I remember, so, of course, it was indelibly etched in my memory forever. Tommy was a lot older than me or my friends. He was 12, and we all lived in fear of him. Whenever he strode onto the little playground area off the apartment complex, 5'8" and broad in the chest, we all usually left to go play somewhere else. Unfortunately, on that day, I was playing alone on the basketball court, and didn't have time to escape. I'd been shooting baskets. I wanted to join the elementary school basketball league next year, so I wanted to get good. That's when Tommy came striding up. Blue was panting about good-naturedly, but looked up when he saw Tommy coming. He was always alone, never having any chums to play around with, and that should have been a red flag to any adult that had been watching. Even the most brutal of children have someone to pal around with, but Tommy was too antisocial and stupid mean for even other bullies to accept. "What you doing, sissy?" he asked, dragging out his limited insults he reserved for sissies or babies. I told him I was just shooting baskets, and he sneered like that was the silliest thing he'd ever heard. "That's not how you get better, stupid. Why don't you play me one-on-one? That'll get you better quicker." I agreed, thinking maybe he had decided to be friendlier. Nothing could have been further from the truth. The game started out with him taking the ball from me and scoring point after point. I was smaller than him, so it was easy for him to steal the ball from me and rack up points while I stumbled around. After a while, I started developing some strategies to get around him, though, and I started making some points on my own. Before I knew it, we were nearly tied, and this was unacceptable to Tommy. The game had been dirty before, but now it was downright brutal. The first time he pushed me, I heard Blue growl a warning. The second time he pushed me, I heard Blue snarl at him. On the third time, his fist coming down to crack me on the side of the head, I heard him yell as Blue sank his teeth into Tommy's backside. Tommy cried out, telling me to get my dog off him. I was shocked. I'd never seen Blue bite anyone. He hung onto the back of his jeans, worrying at him, as Tommy ran off the blacktop towards his house. He let him go as his sneakers left the court, and I laughed about it then, Blue grinning his doggy grin as he came back to rub against my hand. When the police arrived at my house later that day, I didn't think it was so funny. They told us that Tommy's parents had reported a dog bite. Specifically, they had reported that Blue had bitten their son, and now the police had come to take him away. I told them my side of the story, all the while clutching Blue around the neck, but it didn't seem to make any difference to them. A dog had bit, and now he had to be put down. I think Dad saw that I was getting really upset, because he agreed to take Blue to the police station and said he wouldn't let them put him to sleep unless I got to say goodbye. This soothed me a little, but I was still pretty upset as I watched my dog walk away for the last time. When Dad came back, it was already nighttime, but he seemed a little happier. He told me that he had come to an understanding with the police officers, and they had let him drop Blue off at Sanders' farm. Dad said that Mr. Sanders usually took in troubled dogs, or dogs that were going to be put down, and let them work on his farm as farm dogs. That way, Blue could live there, and he wouldn't have to be put to sleep. He'll have all kinds of room to run around, much, much more room than this little apartment, and he'll be happy, Dad had said. I was ecstatic. I was sad that Blue couldn't live with us anymore, but at least the police wouldn't have to put him to sleep. I asked Dad if we could go visit him sometime, to see how he was doing, and Dad said we would see. I went to bed that night and dreamed about Blue as he ran and ran on the farm, herding sheep and running off crows and enjoying his life now that he had a lot of space to play in. I asked Dad a few times if we could go see Blue, but it never seemed to be a good time. Dad always said things like he didn't want to distract him while he was at work, or he didn't want to make it hard for him to settle in by reminding him about his old family. I understood these things. They made sense, but I really wanted to see Blue again. I remember asking a handful of times, but like most kids, my attention span was pretty limited. I got a new game console that year for Christmas. I made the basketball team, so I had to practice almost every day. I was getting ready to go to middle school, so I was a little worried about that. And after a while, I just sort of forgot about Blue. I never really forgot about him. I still thought about him sometimes, in that vague way that kids often do. But I just stopped asking to go see him. Eventually, I guess I stopped thinking about him. Until today, when I saw him on the fence, I hadn't honestly thought about him in years. I was heading to dinner with my parents after work, so I figured I'd let them know what I'd seen. They might like knowing that Blue was okay, and that he was still living a good life. Mom opened the door for me when I knocked, and invited me to help finish fixing dinner. As I chopped vegetables for a salad, I told her what I'd seen, but she didn't seem to understand. The chunk of the knife seemed soothing as it cut the vegetables, and I told her that I'd seen Blue running around the farm where we'd left him. She still seemed a little confused, not really understanding what I was talking about, and when Dad came in, I told him as well. Dad didn't seem confused at all, though. Quite the contrary. He looked a little scared. You saw Blue at Sanders' farm? Yeah, just where you said you dropped him off. He looked really happy. He was running around, chasing birds, and living his best life. He looked up when I drove past and almost seemed to recognize me. I was thinking that I might go visit him, see if he's still... Kid, Dad stated, cutting me off. That's impossible. I guess you're right, I said, thinking it over as we talked about it. Blue would have to be 20 years old by now. Maybe it's one of his puppies. It looks just like him. I might stop by anyway, see if maybe Mr. Sanders will sell me one of Blue's puppies. It would be nice to have a reminder of old Blue around the apartment. My dad sat down heavily, and that made me look up at him with real worry. He seemed like he was debating something, or maybe having a hard time accepting something. I was worried for a minute that he might be having a heart attack. He'd had one last year, and after that his heart hadn't exactly been stable. Instead, he just looked up at me like he might have seen a ghost or something. That's not possible, because Blue is dead. I looked at him in shock. How do you know? Did Mr. Sanders tell you when he... He didn't have to. Blue died the night I took him to the police station. We put him down. My head spun a little. Had they been lying to me this whole time? Dad had told me he'd taken Blue to the farm. He had stuck to that story till eventually I forgot. Had he just been telling me a lie to stop me from being upset? Why had he told me about taking Blue to the farm at all? Sit down. I think it's time I tell you the truth. It's the truth you may have to face yourself one day. So, it's best you hear it now. I sat down, keeping a close eye on my old man, who suddenly seemed less trustworthy than he had a few minutes ago. People in this town always say that they're taking their dogs to the farm. It's been a tradition for at least as long as I can remember. My own dad told me he was taking my dog Scout to Sanders' farm when he got too old and too sick. He said that Scout could run and play for as long as he wanted, and the country air would do him some good. My daddy had never lied to me before, at least not that I knew of, and I was happy that Scout could live somewhere where he could get better. He was old and really sick. I wasn't quite ready to say goodbye to him yet, though. Daddy said we could visit him, but we never did. Eventually, just like you, I kind of forgot about him and went on with my life. I sat in silence, not really sure what to make of all this. So Granddad had lied as well, but this seemed to be a generational lie. Why did so many people use Sanders' farm as a place to leave their dogs? Was it a convenient lie? Or was there more to it? Why did you lie to me? I asked, still not happy about being misled. Because I knew that Blue was going to be killed, and I knew that you weren't ready to lose him. Taking him to the farm was just something people tell kids around here. I'd imagine that you have a lot of friends who've had their dogs taken to Sanders' farm over the years. But why? What's the point of it all? Dad seemed to think about this, weighing his options before settling on, you'll understand when you're older, when you have kids of your own. Sanders' farm is an important place in this community for many reasons, some of them not quite known even to the people who use it. I didn't end up staying for dinner. I left, despite my mother's protests, and drove home. I don't know why, but I was just so irrationally mad about being lied to. I realized, of course, that my parents had lied like this before. I've lived with the Easter Bunny, the Tooth Fairy, Santa Claus, and even a monster that lived in the basement named Mr. Giles, who would get you if you came downstairs after bedtime. They all turned out to be fake, of course. They were lies they told, but lies that they told gently, and only to add magic to my childhood, or keep me from doing foolish things. I could understand those lies, but not this one. this one felt different. This one felt personal. I flopped onto the couch when I got home, and John paused his game as he glanced over at me. "What's wrong, babe? You look upset." "It's nothing," I lied, looking away before finally spilling the whole sad story. I was in tears by the end, my boyfriend holding my hands and patting them gently. He'd grown up here too, and had known my parents only slightly less time than I had. He often gave me some perspective on what was going on, and was my voice of reason in many things. "I'm sure your dad had a good reason. He's a good man. And I don't feel like he'd lie to you for no reason. He probably just wanted to protect you. You were 8 after all." He slid his thumbs over the backs of my hands like I liked, and I smiled as I bent forward to kiss his forehead. "Thanks, hon. You always know just what to say." John grinned through his beard and reached for the controller again. Boy-friendly duties now complete. Besides, it's not all that weird if you think about it. I cocked an eye at him. "What do you mean?" "Well, that's where my dad took Russell after he got hit by that car. He told me he took him to Mr. Sanders' farm so he could get better, but I guess he never did." That gave me pause. John had basically told me the same story my dad had, and it was a little too similar for coincidence. As John went back to rolling and smashing anything that wandered into his field of vision, I opened my phone and sent a text to my friend Matt. Matt and I had been friends nearly as long as John and I had, and I trusted him as much as I trusted my boyfriend. "Hey Matt, just wondering if you've ever heard your parents say anything about taking one of your pets to Sanders' farm. Just curious, trying to settle a bet." The last bit would really hook him. He seemed to like making John look dumb by proving him wrong. I watched John play Elden Ring for a few more minutes before my phone buzzed and I picked it up to see his reply. "Wow, that's weird. Yeah, my dad took Snoopy there after he got too old to walk. I haven't thought about that in forever. That's trippy." I thanked him and sent a text to Jane, a friend from work. Jane lived in the next town over, but Kine was still only about 20 minutes from my hometown. I was wondering if this was just a regional thing, or if it extended farther than our little burg. Janet sent back a string of question marks, and asked why I needed to know something so weird. I told her it was to settle a bet too, and she told me she'd never had a dog get taken to Sanders' farm. "We always just buried them in the backyard," she said. Okay, so maybe it wasn't particularly far-reaching. For the next few hours, as John cursed and growled at the maddening boss he was trying to beat, I sent text after Facebook message after Twitter message and everything in between to old school friends and people I knew from town to ask them if they'd lost dogs too. John's story about Russell had made me realize this was bigger than just my family, and I wanted to know how far exactly. Of the 10 people I got responses from, 6 said their parents had told them they were taking dogs to Sanders' farm. One friend only had cats growing up, and it appeared that they didn't get to live a happy life on Sanders' farm. The other 2 had never been allowed to have pets, so they'd never had anything to lose. The one person whose dog hadn't gone to Sanders' farm had escaped while the family was on vacation, so the whereabouts of the dog were never discovered. The findings were inconclusive, but they were still pretty damn close. Close enough that as John and I climbed into bed that night, I had already decided that I was going to make a stop on my way home from work tomorrow. The plume of dirt that spewed up behind me as I drove up the long driveway to Sanders' farm was the only bell the old farmer seemed to need. He was waiting for me on the porch with a glass of tea, and a weathered old smile spread across his sunburnt face. "Afternoon, kid. What can I do for you?" We shook hands as I introduced myself, and he handed me the glass of tea as I explained why I was there. Mr. Sanders nodded, asking if I'd like to come inside. He didn't seem surprised by the question at all. Quite the contrary. It was as if he'd been waiting for me to come and ask it all this time. I told him that I thought I'd rather sit on the porch and discuss it, and he nodded as he took a seat in one of the old rockers, indicating that I should take the other. Every now and again, someone puts 2 and 2 together and realizes that everyone brings their dogs to Sanders' farm. It's not a new concept. People have been doing it since before the Great Depression. I can't tell you how long it's been going on, but I can tell you how it started if you'd like to hear. I nodded, and he began his story. The first dog to be brought here wasn't really brought at all. His name was Jip, and he was my friend. He was just a pup when I heard him crying one afternoon. He'd gotten himself stuck in a trap, and his pack had deserted him, probably thinking he was done for. He was just a little half-starved thing, but he growled at me as I came to get him loose. Turned out I didn't have to do too much. The trap had nearly tore his front paw off, and he was bleeding out. It seemed a shame to let him die, so I held him down and tied his foot off with a handkerchief. He struggled a lot, snapping and snarling as I tried to stop the bleeding, but eventually he quieted down as the blood oozed out of him and he became less coherent. I scooped him up and took him back home, cutting the little bit of skin off that held his paw on and dressing it as best I could. I was afraid he had died for a little while, but when I heard him come to, snarling and snuffling and howling, I knew he'd likely recover. He smiled as he remembered it, likely thinking of the little wolf pup as he tried to act twice his size. We started off slow, but eventually I earned his trust. His paw would never grow back, but he managed to teach himself to walk with 3 legs. I had done a good enough job of cleaning it up that it didn't get infected, and after a few months the lack of a paw didn't seem to slow him down. He couldn't return to his pack. I'm not sure he ever even tried, but he was my dog after that, and I loved him. His smile became sad, and I felt we were about to come to the part of the story where he lost that friend. We lived together for about 12 years, both of us growing old as the seasons passed. Jip's gait was slower, and his joints creaked when he walked, but he was still always willing to walk around with me when I did my work. I was in my late 40s, working the land as I do now, when we stumbled upon a bear one day. He had decided to bed down in my corn crib, and when I went down to check my stores, he woke up and charged me. Jip got between us. He was never far from my side, and gave me time to get my rifle. I put the bear down as the 3-legged wolf kept him from attacking me, but the damage was done. Jip had been slashed a dozen times, and I sat with him as he lay bleeding on the dirt floor of my storehouse. Mr. Sanders got a far-off look as he watched the sun sink, seeing far-off days as the sun set over his crops. I buried him in the field, the place he loved the most. I'd built him a house, put him a ratty blanket on the porch, but he seemed to love sleeping amongst the swaying corn plants and amidst the dirt of the field. I buried him there, thinking he might nourish the crops as his spirit lay content, but I never could have foreseen what would happen. That night, I heard a loud barking, a barking that sounded like Jip's. I rushed out with my rifle and found him smiling and barking at the edge of the field, good as new. Behind him, though, the crops had grown 4 times as plentiful. Corn and beans and squash and potatoes, everything else I grew in those days, too. Jip looked at me as though to say, "Thanks for a good life," and then he dove back into the field and I never saw him again. That was how it started. "Well, what started?" I asked, feeling my skin prickle. "The crops came in, and I brought my wares to the nearest market. I made enough money to build a new barn, buy a new horse, and eat like a king that winter. There had been enough food to stuff my storehouse, and the excess I'd taken to market was more like a normal yield from any other year. The next year I planted as I had every year, and old Jip brought in another bountiful harvest. I bought more land, made plans to plant an orchard, began to think about buying cattle and sheep. I even thought about becoming some kind of land baron in this underdeveloped part of the country. The next 2 years were just as fine, but I was in for a surprise." He coughed a little and asked me if I'd get him a glass of tea from the kitchen. I obliged, moving into the house and taking a glass from the cabinet as I moved to the battered old fridge. I refilled my own as I poured the cold tea into the new glass. I was suddenly very thirsty, and my throat felt dry as a bone. When I brought it back to him, he thanked me before taking a long sip. After 4 years of amazing yield, the 5th year was a disappointment. The crops did well as they ever did before Jip died, but the bounty was nowhere to be seen. I had just begun planting the fruit trees, and just started making inquiries about livestock. I worried that I wouldn't be able to afford any of the plans I'd been making, and that temporary success might just slip through my fingers. The next year was much the same, but I had noticed a small decline in the quality of my produce. There had been no blight, no insects to speak of, but the crops seemed weaker, more feeble this year. I began to panic. What would I do if the fields stopped making? What could I do if the vegetables stopped coming? I tried different things that spring to rejuvenate the fields. I bought tonics from a traveling man. I put down fertilizer. I tried increasing the water I gave the fields. The fertilizer, however, had made me remember that I had used something very different to fertilize the land 4 years ago, and that made me wonder if doing so might rejuvenate the fields again. The sun was sinking lower now, the fiery ring just over the tops of the corn as they waved merrily. And so I set out to find a proper sacrifice for the land, something to bring it back again. I tried forest animals. Jip had been of the forest after all, but to no avail. I tried strays from the nearby town, but they did nothing. In my desperation, I'm ashamed to say that I bought and killed animals from the local stableman, even going so far as to buy and slaughter a horse, but they did little to rejuvenate the crop. Then one evening, as I came back from the market with my pathetic yield, I nearly struck a child as he came bounding into the road. The dog with him, just an average mutt, pushed him out of the way, and my tires crunched over the animal. I heard the boy cry out in despair as he cradled the dying dog in his arms. Its back was clearly broken, but I wasted no time. I took the dog with me, driving away quickly as the father came rushing out to see what all the fuss was about. The setting sun cut fire lines across his eyes, and the sting must have been uncomfortable, if not eye-watering. Mr. Sanders seemed not to notice, though. He was dead by the time I arrived home, and I buried him in the field, as I had with Jip. The crops came back, the land thrived, and I think that was when I realized what the land wanted. The old dog had been loved, just as Jip had been loved, and that love seemed to nourish the land like nothing else. From that day on, I seemed to always have my eyes peeled for dogs. The sick ones could sometimes be taken off the owner's hands, but I had been known to buy them from struggling families as well. As the years went by and the town grew, so too did my prosperity. I was one of the largest farmers in the region. My produce sold at every general store and market for miles around. I've seen the horses replaced by automobiles, seen the carts that came to get my food replaced by trucks, and all the while, my fields continue to put out more of the stuff I needed to grow. But there was a price, and the price has become quite steep over the years. I was still mulling over what he had said, and when he paused to drain the dregs of his glass, I asked the question that had been wavering on the edge of my mind. "Mr. Sanders, how old are you?" Mr. Sanders fixed me with a mischievous grin, and it took years off of him. "Just starting to put it together, eh? I was born in 1815. I bought this land in 1845. The year I buried Jip, I was 45, and I have stayed that age ever since. Despite having more crops than I know what to do with, the land also grants me life for my sacrifice. I can't explain why, and I can't explain how, but I keep living as long as the land thrives." I wanted to deny what he was saying, but I could find no argument against it. The man looked old, sun-weathered, but not ancient. How would he manage to keep from being noticed? If he had really owned this farm for so long, how had no one seen? As my farm grew, so too did the town. The market thrived, the people prospered, and thus began the agreement. I had grown tired of finding my own sacrifices, so I made them a deal. They would bring me their dogs, those who were sick or those who were too old to carry on, and I would continue to make the town flourish. By that time, I was making a sacrifice once a month. Today, I make a sacrifice once a day. Before too long, I fear that it will become unmanageable, and the farm will fail." I said nothing, just sitting and staring, wishing I could believe that this man was crazy. I suppose that wouldn't be too bad. I've grown tired of living and making sacrifices, and maybe it's finally time to rest. Nothing lasts forever, after all. Not even immortality, he said, grinning. The grin made his face look skeletal, his true age shining through at last. I thanked him for the tea, thanked him for the story, and stood up shakily. Take care of yourself, kid, and don't worry. Old Blue is as happy as any other dog here. You did what you could for him, and now he's at rest where no one can hurt him ever again. I nodded dumbly, my legs shivering as I walked down the stairs to my car. As I climbed in, I thought I saw a familiar brown snout as it poked from the rows of corn plants. My hands froze halfway to the ignition. He was grinning at me, looking out through the corn and panting happily. It was as if he had come back one last time to say goodbye, and as we locked eyes, he slid slowly back into the field. I've driven by that farm once a day since, but I've never seen Blue again. I do worry, though, about what will happen to all those ghosts if something should happen to Sanders' farm. The crops have begun to look a little different lately, less healthy, more like plants that are rotting from the inside. If the vegetables die, if the farm fails, then what will happen to all those spirits that call the land their home? There was a sign next to the dirt road today that said, "For sale by owner." Suppose soon we may very well find out. Just got the fireplace going, so it's time to settle in for some cozy stories and a warm fire. Let's see what else we've got. Oh, when our next storyteller finds a puppy, he gets a little more than he bargains for. Sometimes when we take in a new dog, they turn out to be a little bigger than we thought. Sometimes they have trauma from a previous owner. This one has a little of both, I suppose, but he also might have some strange things all his own. You have to be careful when you find a puppy. If you read this, do not try to find me. She's in the shadows, watching with burning eyes, anywhere and everywhere. No matter how far I go or where I am, she's there, watching. I'll try to explain what happened. It started with a walk in the woods. I usually go there to clear my head, but this time was a bit different. Life has been difficult. My father, the only consistent figure in my life, passed away a few months before. My relationship with my girlfriend broke down. I was working as much as I could, but I could never keep up with my debt. Life was becoming a landslide, and I had the intention to end it. What better place than the woods? It was a beautiful day. I went for a walk with a backpack filled with rope and a pre-tied noose. I found a tree off the beaten path I could tie myself to. I expected a dog walker would find me at some point. They always seem to find the bodies. I was securing the noose to a branch when the puppy found me. I didn't recognize the breed. It had shaggy black fur with a faint silver ridge along the spine and beautiful, burning amber eyes. It looked at me and I felt ashamed. It seemed too young to be walking free in the woods, and it must have been lost. I untied the noose and climbed down from the tree. The pup stood waiting, its tail wagging. I knelt beside it and gave it a stroke of the head. It had no collar. He could have been lost or abandoned. "All right, boy, what are you doing out here?" I asked. He wagged his tail and licked my hand. There was some movement amongst the bushes. I called out to see if its owner was nearby, but got no response. The weather began to turn. Heavy gray clouds quickly filled the sky, and thunder rumbled through the trees. The air became thick with the storm energy. "We should get you somewhere safe," I decided, taking the pup back to my car. That was when I started noticing things were strange. The rain began to come down, drumming heavily on the car roof. The once beautiful day became dark. I decided to drive towards a vet I knew locally. If they couldn't take him in, they could surely suggest someone who would. They can check for a chip and maybe find the owners. I put the puppy in the passenger seat of my car. As I drove out of the car park, a flash of lightning showed something amongst the trees. A silhouette of a deer or a large dog, maybe. barely distinguishable from the shadows. I drove on. With the next lightning flash, the creature was closer, just off the side of the road. It could have been a man, or it was something four-legged, but facing me. 2 embers ignited in what could have been a pair of eyes. I didn't feel like waiting to find out what was watching me. I sped up and pulled out onto the main road. As I drove, the pup fidgeted in excitement, sniffing at the seat and playfully mouthing at my hand as I tried to hold him in place. I went to the vet only to find them closed. I searched my phone for dog rescue homes, but there was nothing nearby. "Looks like you're coming home with me, boy," I told him. I think he looked happy about that. Maybe I was projecting. Lightning flashed again. If I was going to take him home, I thought I'd better stock up on some food. It would require dipping into my overdraft, but at this point I didn't really care about anything but this dog. I stopped at my local shop and left him inside the car. At least I thought I did. While I was at the checkout buying a single tin of dog food and some treats, he appeared yapping at my feet. "Can't bring dogs in here," the miserable sleep-deprived shopkeeper snapped at me. I didn't. Sorry," I stumbled back. I scooped him up under my arm and went back to the car with my shopping. The door was locked. He must have snuck out before I shut the door. I was sure he was still inside when I locked it, though. I saw him through the window. I must have been wrong. I couldn't claim to be in the clearest state of mind, given my original plans for the day. I bundled him back in the car with the shopping. Despite not necessarily being a good boy, I told him that he was, and tore open the bag to invite him to a treat. I started my car, and there was another flash of lightning. It cast a shadow over the road where the thing stood, watching me, eyes burning. It was getting closer, close enough to make me afraid. I floored it, pulling away from the shop and into the road without even looking, my tires spinning to find traction. I checked the rearview mirror as I sped away to see if the shadowy creature was giving chase, but I saw nothing. I looked forward, and with a flash of lightning, it was there in the middle of the road. 2 eyes burning bright as fire hovered in the shadows of an old oak tree. The creature was at one with the darkness, appearing only in the shadow of the flickering lightning. In the brief moment of shadow, I could just make out faint wisps of eerie pale glow weaving through the void. My eyes were unable to make sense of the shapes. I jumped on the brakes, forcing the car behind me to screech to a halt. The puppy tumbled forward and into the footwell with a yelp. "What are you doing?" the driver shouted from behind me. I ignored him and helped the puppy back onto the seat. He wagged in excitement. I looked around for the beast, but there was no sign of it. The lightning had stopped. The rain was lightening now, and the dark clouds were rolling away as quickly as they came, letting the daylight through. The road before me was clear. The driver behind me sounded his horn. He didn't see anything. "You okay, boy?" I asked. He seemed unconcerned about anything that was happening in the world. "We should get home," I said. I drove through the town, wary of every shadow. Felt like I was being watched, but I couldn't see whatever was watching me. Every flicker of light or patch of darkness put me on edge. Car headlights reflected off the wet road and cast images onto my mind. I began to doubt my sanity. I was heading home for shelter and safety, but I'd never felt safe there before. I lived in a room in a drafty old red brick Victorian house riddled with damp. I was overdue on rent to the landlady, Miss Whitaker, who was a harsh old woman hoarding money to take to the grave. She didn't allow noise or visitors, and she certainly didn't allow pets. Encountering her with the puppy in my arms was as terrifying as whatever was stalking me, because at least I knew Miss Whitaker was real. But there I was, the noose still in my backpack. I just needed to help out this dog before I could go back to my original plan. Why should I care about anything else? By the time I got home, the clouds had mostly parted, and we were getting the last of the afternoon sunshine. The daylight put me at some ease. I picked up the pup and its food and rushed into the house, hoping to get to the stairs before Miss Whitaker noticed me. Too slow. She appeared behind me in the gloomy hallway as I was halfway up the stairs. "Shouldn't you be at work?" she asked in a tone that was searching for a problem. "Day off," I replied without turning around, hoping she hadn't spotted the puppy. "Oh, I hope it's Payday off. Rent is due, she said with suspicion. Of course, I said, and continued walking upstairs. What is that you've got there? She asked. I turned to face her, resigned to revealing the puppy. But when I turned, the puppy wasn't in my arms. I looked around at the floor and saw no sign of it. Miss Whittaker had a ghostly appearance. Her gray hair and pale face were monochrome in the drab darkness of the hallway. She looked at me impatiently, and eventually I replied, Nothing. It's just some shopping. Nothing too expensive, I hope. You need to pay my rent, she snapped. Then I saw it again. Behind Miss Whittaker in the shadows lurked the beast. Its flaming eyes drew up behind her. The shadow grew, almost submerging her in a shadowy void. For a moment, I hoped it would pull her in. Miss Whittaker said something, but I wasn't listening to her, concerned only with the specter in the shadows. I turned and rushed to the bottom of the stairs, but Miss Whittaker recoiled from me. I slapped at the light switch and the hallway brightened, the creature disappearing. Then I ran back up to my room. I slammed the door behind me and put the light on, then rushed over to the debris of dirty washing and litter to the window to pull the curtains open, exposing the remaining day to erase any darkness from the bedroom. I put the puppy on the floor and suddenly felt disgusted with myself. The room was filthy. Dirty dishes were stacked on the bedside table. Every surface was caked with dust. I could barely see the carpet for my mess. This wasn't a fit place for a dog to live. I had the immediate urge to tidy up. I cleaned a small space in the corner and emptied half the tin of dog food onto a clean bowl. While the puppy ate, I tidied up. Then I heard stomping up the stairs, Miss Whittaker shouting out, What is wrong with you? Why have you put the lights on? That is my electricity you're wasting. She then banged on the door. Have you got the lights on in there too? Open up. Sorry, I just need some light. I'm tidying. You? Ha! This was the closest I had ever come to hearing her laugh. Turn it off now, or you can move out. Please, just leave me alone for a bit. She banged on the door again. Off, now. When she noticed the light remains on, she said, Fine, I'll sort it myself, and stomped back downstairs. The puppy was eating happily. I found a half-full bottle of water and emptied it into a small dish for him to drink. I watched him while sitting on the edge of my bed. Then the puppy had his fill and came over to sit by my feet. I lifted him onto the bed, and he got comfortable, resting his head on my thigh as his amber eyes looked up at me. He began to sleep as I stroked the top of his head, and it seemed at that moment we were both content. Then the lights went out. Miss Whittaker must have switched my electricity off at the fuse box. The fading daylight from outside the window was not enough to extinguish the shadows in the corner by the wardrobe. Flaming eyes slowly appeared from nowhere, as if the darkness was a doorway. The monster was in my room. I picked up the puppy and edged away along the bed. Soon my back was against the wall and I had nowhere else to go. The fiery eyes grew closer. Ethereal wisps danced from the darkness until my eyes could finally make sense of their shape and movement. I could see a vague outline of 4 limbs walking, hackles raised down its back. A muzzle snarled at me, dripping with drool. The great hound became clearer beyond its spectral hue, bigger than any dog I'd ever seen. It had a pale streak down its back like the puppy. It padded beyond the shadow to show thick, shaggy black fur. It was ready to pounce at any minute. It gave a guttural growl, exposing great white fangs. While I recoiled helplessly, the puppy squirmed free and clambered down my leg to the floor, the ridge of pale fur down its back, showing white with ethereal light. It ran over to the great black beast, which never broke its gaze away from me. Then, as if breaking from a trance, it looked down at the pup, lowering its snout towards it. "No!" I shouted. I couldn't let it devour the helpless thing. "No!" I shouted again. I picked up the lamp from my bedside table in a pathetic attempt to brandish any sort of weapon. The beast looked at me with contempt, then looked back down at the puppy. It lowered its snout and licked it across its face. The puppy brushed up against the monster and wagged its tail. The great hound inspected the pup with sniffs and licks of maternal care. The mother then picked the puppy up by the scruff of the neck, and they walked into the shadow. fading into wisps of spectral light before disappearing. The puppy appears every so often to play, no matter where I am, home, work, even when I was in the police interview room. The mother is never far away. They usually disappear back into the shadows before anyone else can see them. Usually, those who have seen them don't live long to tell about it. I know they think they're protecting me, but they didn't need to kill Mrs. Whitaker. I didn't notice for a few days until the smell crept through the floorboards. At her door, I heard the buzzing of flies. I called the police to break into her room, and they found her mauled. The coroner ruled that it was a dog attack, although they couldn't explain how a dog got in and out of the locked room. The mother never fully comes out of the shadows, but she watches me. In the corner of my eye, I'll catch its fiery gaze. I don't think she means me harm, but I've seen what she can do, and it's hard not to be afraid. The pup is a good boy, but they're both overprotective. I've seen their eyes appear whenever anyone angers or upsets me. I know she intends to kill them. Death seems like nothing to her. My supervisor at work was found dead in the stockroom after he criticized the time I had taken off due to my mental health. I admit it got to me. He was mauled like Mrs. Whitaker. The hound also appeared after my ex-girlfriend came over and demanded her TV back. She forced her way in, and I was desperate for her to leave, so I ended up giving it to her. But it wasn't about the TV. She was just insistent on arguing. She didn't make it out of the house. I tried to stop them. After the deaths, I had to run. I'm innocent, I swear it, but if the police turn up to arrest me, I can't imagine what the hounds would do to them. I found somewhere secluded to live. I won't say where, but it seems mostly safe, and I'm content with a simple life off the grid. I have had occasional troubles. Some men tried to break into the caravan where I've been staying. That didn't last long. I had to bury their bodies in a ditch one night. The dogs were just protecting me. At least I'm not suicidal anymore. What does that say about me, that I'm willing to live even when I'm such a risk to others? As long as people leave me alone, they'll be safe. I can't control what comes from the shadows. Man, it's really coming down out there. Good thing we've got such a cozy spot to sit and wait out the rain. This next one's about a dog with a strange trick. Some of our dogs can roll over. Some of them can play dead. This one seems like it has a staring problem. The original poster loves their dog, but if he stands up and stares one more time, they just don't know what they're gonna do. I know what you must be thinking. What a horrible person. I know. I've thought it too. The fact I'm genuinely thinking about sending away my dog makes me feel pretty guilty. Then I remember what he's been doing, and my guilt is replaced with fear. This started about a month ago. I came home early from work one day, absolutely furious, and clutching a parting gift from my boss. My Christmas bonus was a ham or something. I sighed with a hand pressed firmly against my throbbing temple and placed the mystery meat in the fridge. The pounding behind my eyes got more and more intense until I leveled my fist and punched the fridge. The throbbing in my head didn't go away, but there was a new guest, as it was now accompanied by the pain in my knuckles. I let out a deep sigh that was childish. It was at that moment that Rufus came padding in, his big brown eyes gazing up at me, as if wondering what that noise had been. "Your dad was pretty dumb just now," I said, crouching down to run my hands across his thick fur. He wagged his tail and let out an excited noise as I petted him. I raised my eyebrows. I wish I could just curl up in a ball and chill like you do. Rufus, of course, paid no mind to this, and after realizing he wouldn't be receiving more pets, padded away back to his comfortable bed. I rolled my eyes and took a deep breath. While disappointing, this whole Christmas bonus thing wasn't the end of the world. Sure, my boss was an evil prick, But I had a whole 2 weeks of paid vacation stored up, and he couldn't stop me from using it. So, screw him. I'm going to relax and spend my vacation doing whatever I want. How about it, Rufus? Want to do nothing? I asked loudly. Rufus simply yawned. It was the next morning that I discovered that the mystery meat was still in my fridge. I peeled back the wrapped paper to see a red mass bundled in saran wrap. I furrowed my brow. Gotta be beef. Rufus sat at my side, eagerly waiting. I'm not a butcher. How would I know what it is? I'll just fry it? Everything tastes good fried with onions. I leaned down and booped Rufus's snoot. I bet you would taste good fried with onions, too. He agreed as his tail wagged back and forth. Well, don't you have a high opinion of yourself? I cut off a large chunk of the mystery meat and threw it in a pan with onions, salt, pepper, and butter. I hope you taste good, Christmas bonus, because you don't really look that great. I probably talk to myself too much. Having a full conversation probably isn't healthy. I raised my eyebrow and decided to turn on the TV for my own sanity. It blinked on to a cooking channel. I glared at the TV. Don't you shame me. Then I flipped to the news and got right back to frying the beef. Thoughts and prayers go out to the victims and families of the late. I looked down at the large mass of beef left over. Hey, Rufus, I picked up a raw slab. Want something to chew on? He dashed on over like any dog would when presented with a hunk of meat. All right, you want it? Sit, I commanded with my most authoritative voice. Rufus gave no care, lunging upward and snagging it from my hand. Hey, I said, laughing. That was rude. Rufus took one last look at me before tearing into the beef with vigor. Still chuckling to myself, I once again turned back to the news. The search is still on for Maya Kelling, a local who was reported missing on December 14th by her boyfriend. She was in the Beluva area, and anyone with information is encouraged to call this number. I shut it off. The news is so depressing. Rufus paid me no mind, as he continued munching away with that playful ferocity of a domesticated animal. I took a deep breath and went to have a smell of the beef. It smelled god-awful. Jesus, what did I do to this thing? There was something deeply off-putting about that smell. It didn't smell rotten or decayed. It smelled foreign. It filled me with apprehension and a strange sense of dread. I shook my head and felt a wave of stupidity roll over me. The feeling was not too dissimilar when you were watching a scary YouTube video at night by yourself and you want to turn the lights on. I felt like a little bitch, but the feeling of nervousness and the fact that no one but me would judge me for throwing all this meat out made my decision easy. This was going straight into the garbage. I threw it in and did my utmost to forget about it. Take out it is. Having stuffed myself with pizza, I crashed hard. I'm a heavy sleeper, so it takes a lot to wake me up. Yet, I was woken up. A loud crash echoed through my bedroom as I shot bolt upright and listened for a moment. I heard dragging noises. My heart pounded in my chest. I stood, having armed myself with my pistol. I took a couple of careful steps forward. The noise became more distinguished. There was a gnawing and an eager snort. A sense of dread filled me as I rounded the corner, expecting the worst. "Rufus!" I shouted, seeing an absolutely devastating mess. He had torn open the trash, and it was scattered everywhere. I groaned and slumped my shoulders. "Not only did you scare the crap out of me, I'm also going to have to clean up your friggin' mess. Come on, man." Rufus had pillaged what he was looking for and scampered off without even looking at me. Having fully cleaned up the mess, I stood up and stretched, cracking my back in a few places. "You're an ass for that," I said as I washed my hands. "I'm going back to bed. Good night. Love you," I trailed off. Rufus was sitting on his bed, gnawing on something. "Hey, what do you have there?" I walked forward and reached down. To my great surprise, it was the first time I was greeted by a low growl. "Hey now," I said, my words barely making it out of my throat because of the immediate surprise and fear. I took a few steps back and knelt down to get a good view of what he was gnawing on. The mystery meat. I reached forward tentatively and got met with the same low growl as before. "Rufus, come on, give me that. I think it's bad." But what Rufus did next sent a chill down my spine. He simply stopped gnawing on it and stared me dead in my eyes. No more movement, no tail wagging, nothing. I must have sat there for 30 seconds before I did anything. I stood up, forcing myself to turn around despite every single fiber of my being telling me not to take my eyes off of him. "Fine, have it your way." Couldn't help but take a peek over my shoulder as I walked away. He sat motionless, his eyes still locked onto mine. Turned on my light and closed my door, lying in bed until my eyes got too heavy to keep open. After waking up, it took a few seconds to recollect the night before. When I did, I fully opened my door to reveal Rufus curled up in a ball. He was curled up in his dog bed, fast asleep. I felt the weary tension within me wither away. "I need to get out of the house," I muttered. I came home that night to a dark abode. Having been drinking, my bearings were slightly askew, and I found myself fumbling with my keys a bit. As I pushed open the door to my house, I was greeted by an unfriendly darkness that settled itself over an empty house. I pawed for the light switch for a moment, until I found it, flipping it on with my one hand. "Crap!" I cried in fear, as my gaze was met by a great black mass standing in the middle of the living room. It wobbled slightly, as if unsure of its footing, before it fell to all fours. "Rufus?" I cried, my heart playing in my ribcage like a bongo. What the hell were you doing, you creepy-ass mutt?" Rufus just stared, tail stationary, eyes fixated on me. I'm gonna go relax." "Cut that out." Rufus didn't blink. Neither did I. I slammed my door closed and sat on the edge of my bed, taken aback. Jesus, that was friggin' scary. As I took off my shoes, the image of the shadows in the dark, form stretched in a way it wasn't supposed to, made my skin crawl. I've seen dogs standing up before, but in that goofy cute way. Hell, I've even seen dogs do a headstand. But this, standing in the middle of the room in the dark, just staring at the door, it unsettled me to my core. My sleep was troubled, as if I had a nightmare I couldn't quite remember. I woke up to that feeling of unease creeping its way back up my spine. To stall, I scrolled through the news, but nothing could take my mind off of it. Not Bitcoin plunging in value, not the disappearance of that local girl, not Taco Bell bringing back the nacho fries. I just kept imagining what Rufus must be doing at any given moment. Standing there. Just standing there. I growled and punched my pillow. I'm acting like a wuss. Gotta get up. I rolled out of bed and crept to my door, heart pounding. I stared at the handle and reached my hand out slowly, my heart beginning to thump against my chest at an increased tempo, with a deep breath that caught in my chest as I eased the door open. I felt fear jolt through my body as I saw him, standing once again in the middle of the living room, his furry back to me, as he stood absolutely motionless, staring at the wall. My words caught in my throat before I could speak. I did the worst possible thing I could have possibly done, and quietly closed the bedroom door. The fear began to set in worse. I locked my door and collapsed on my bed, breathing fast. He was out there, standing upright. I couldn't open that door again. I couldn't make it out of the house. Not with him there. Not with him just standing there. I found myself nauseous with terror that had possessed my body. I sat there staring at the door for the better part of an hour before finally getting up the courage to once again check outside. crept closer, each footfall on the soft carpet surely giving me away to the keen ears of Rufus. My heart pounded in near apoplectic terror as I once again laid my hands on the knob. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to open the door. Once it did, I peered through the crack to try and see where he might be. Still standing. Trying my best to summon fury, I opened the door wide and shouted, "Rufus!" All the anger I summoned was turned into terror vapors when Rufus slowly turned his head to face me. He turned his body next. He took a step. He took another one. And another. I screamed in horror as he began marching towards me, off kilter, one step at a time. I once more slammed the door and locked it, stumbling backwards in panic. I didn't hear a sound at my door, but I saw the shadow of something standing there. "Rufus, stop it right now!" It was met with silence again. I was met with a terrible sound. It sounded like when a dog yawns and their voice stretches and bends. But this had purpose. This wasn't just a noise. It was measured, meaningful. "Get out of my house!" I screamed in terror as it continued. "Get out now!" The sound stopped. The shadow at my door was slowly and clumsily plodding away. I shook, my breath coming in gasps. I stayed awake in my room for the rest of the day, until finally thirst gripped me and I couldn't bear it any longer. I left the room, armed with the small pistol I keep for safety. There he was, curled up in his dog bed, fast asleep. I kept my eyes locked on him as I tiptoed around, gathering food and water before dashing to my room. I typed this now to you, asking the community of people who deal with these things. If I call the cops, they'll call animal control. They'll either laugh in my face or simply take Rufus. I don't want that. I want my Rufus back. My good boy. What's happening to him? Why is he like this? Storm's really raging out there. But sounds like it might be getting ready to peter out. I think we've got time for one more. This one's a doozy that I like to read around this time of year. Gets me in the mood for the holiday season. We all have pets we love, and we all have pets we miss. Wouldn't it be great, though, if we could see those pets just one more time? Maybe on a specific time of the year. Halloween has always been a time when the barriers between the spirit world and our world are a little less tangible. So, it's not outside the realm of possibility that you might have a Halloween visitor. "Come on, Dad, let's go!" Lily stomped a slipper-clad foot on the sidewalk as she looked back at her father. She was ready to go trick-or-treating, and it seemed like nothing but Josh was standing in the way of her sweet treats. He was sitting on the front step of his childhood home, a well-loved cul-de-sac teeming with costumed children. The moon hung overhead, a ghostly sickle that presided over this Halloween night, and her dad was sitting with his back against the smooth stairs, as he found his eyes tracking the multitudes as they passed. The children laughed and screamed as they stalked by, the street a sea of superheroes, video game characters, colorful animals, and everything in between. He let his eyes drift past the excited pageantry, though. He was looking for one shape in particular. Josh's mom smiled at him, slipping her hand into Lily's and giving her a little tug. "Come on, hun. Your dad's waiting for someone. We'll go trick-or-treating while he waits." Lily looked interested. "Who are you waiting for, Daddy?" Of course, she wouldn't have remembered from last year. She'd been excited about trick-or-treating, showing off her Wonder Woman costume, and swinging between her father and her mother's hands as they walked. However, Laura was 6 months pregnant this year, and had opted out of the hour drive to get to his mother's house. She had smiled at Josh knowingly as he left, and told him to tell her hi for her. Lily's grandmother smoothed her hair as it sat under the tall princess hat. It's just an old friend, dear. Your father meets him here every year. Well, you're gonna miss out on the candy, Lily said, her tone stating firmly that she wouldn't be sharing if he didn't come. Josh smiled. That's okay, Lily. You go and have fun with Grandma, okay? Lily just shrugged, her grandmother's tugging hand finally leading her towards the waiting cacophony of spooky delights. She glanced back as they walked onto the street, but was soon lost in the crowd and probably wouldn't remember anything about this conversation until next year. Josh leaned back, getting comfy as he waited for him to arrive. He did this every year, every Halloween after that first so many years ago. In many ways, the visits were what Josh looked forward to the most about Halloween. Sure, the candy was nice, the costumes were great, but seeing his friend was why he always came home for Halloween. No matter where Josh was, no matter what he was doing, he always came home for Halloween. This was the night he got to see him. This was the night that Josh got to see Snarf again. Snarf had been a mutt. He was a bull terrier mixed with a basset hound mixed with God only knew what else. They had grown up together. Snarf was just a puppy when Josh had got him, and he was Josh's best friend for many years. When Josh thought back on that time in his life, he was glad he had gotten Snarf when he did. Kindergarten had been a difficult time for him, and his sheltered upbringing hadn't really prepared him for suddenly being around so many children. He was awkward, and not what you would call popular. He had thick glasses, was overweight, and his isolation had made him painfully shy. The other kids who had gone to daycare and Cub Scouts and T-ball together, took one look at him and dismissed him as a social outcast. It was tough, being unwanted at the age of 5. His mom thought a dog might help Josh's confidence, or at least ease some of the loneliness. In many ways, Josh believed his mother had recognized that the funk he was in was partially her fault, and was trying to make amends. She worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and often Josh was left in the care of his grandmother. She loved him and always doted on him, but she wasn't always up for the games a 5-year-old would be interested in. Thinking about it over the years, Josh often thought that Snarf was a way for her to alleviate some of the guilt about leaving him alone. Whatever the reason, he had loved her for it. His mother found Snarf at the Humane Society. He was a little smiling ball of fluff, and when he put his feet against the glass, she had known that he would be perfect. He had been waiting for Josh when she had come to pick him up that day, and the boy's surprise had turned to joy as the wet puppy tongue slid over his face. They sat in the back seat the whole way home, the dog's head against his stomach, panting happily as Josh scratched him behind the ears. He was that rare animal whose temperament never led him to jump up on people or bark for no reason. His accidents were few and far between, and he was easy to house train. They called him Snarf because he had a deviation in his nose that caused him to make a snarfing sound rather than a proper bark. He was the best dog, the only one Josh had ever owned, and Josh had flourished with the help of his new companion. Snarf had gotten him out of the house, helping him shed some of the baby fat that had made him the subject of so much ridicule. He had also been a great icebreaker to help Josh introduce himself to some of the neighborhood kids. By the time he had entered first grade, Josh had a few pals, but none of them could hold a candle to his friendship with that wiggling little mass of fur and ears. He was eternally thankful for the time he'd gotten with Snarf, but it would never have been enough. Josh dumped a fistful of candy into each of their buckets, and the trio of Disney princesses said thank you as they ran to the next house in a flurry of skirts and sneakers. A pirate wandered up and gave him his best "Arg!" Josh rewarded him with a couple of full-size Snicker bars, and he thanked him before wobbling off on his fake peg leg. Josh kept scanning the crowd, unsure what was taking his friend so long this year. He was usually here by now, but he had been late before. He sat up a little as he saw a small ghost, 4 legs poking from below a bedsheet. When it turned and wagged its tail at a larger ghost who was walking behind it, Josh got comfortable again. He sat scanning around, hoping it wouldn't be too much longer. He'd sit here all night if he had to, though. Josh would sit here till midnight if it bought him 5 minutes with his buddy. Josh had Snarf for 5 years, and those 5 years were filled with mostly good times between a boy and his dog. Snarf was never a chewer, or prone to digging holes, and Josh couldn't remember ever having to fill in a hole or run after him as he chased a cat. Snarf also knew where the boundaries of his home were, and Josh never saw him run out of the yard or get in the road after a car. He was a good boy, and the neighborhood loved him. He would likely have a long and happy life if it hadn't been for Josh. To this day, he blamed himself for what had happened to Snarf. It had all started when Reggie moved into the neighborhood. Reggie moved in when Josh was 10, and his family took up residence in the Cranston house. Mr. Cranston had died about a month before, and though his family hadn't been neighbors with them, Mr. Cranston was a nice old man who was known to the whole neighborhood. He had always had the best yard displays for Christmas or Halloween, and he had given out the best candy to trick-or-treaters. When the ambulance came to take him away one night, everyone had hoped for the best, but poor Mr. Cranston had died of a heart attack. Luckily, he had been on the phone with his daughter when it had happened, or who knows when they would have found him. So when a moving van came up the street, bound for Mr. Cranston's old house, Josh and his friends had hopped on their bikes and went to check it out. Josh had a group of friends that he hung out with then. Terry, Walt, and Patrick lived in the same neighborhood as he did, and they'd been friends for years. When the new boy was seen unpacking boxes from the van, they introduced themselves and welcomed him to the neighborhood. He was a big kid, tall and muscular, and Josh had gotten a weird feeling about him almost at once. "I'm Josh," he said, extending a hand. "We were just about to go play some ball if you're interested." "Reggie," the boy said, squeezing his hand a little too hard, almost like he meant to hurt him. "Yeah, sounds like that might be fun." One short conversation was enough to let the boys know that Reggie's interests were different than theirs. Most of them had agreed later that they felt he probably wasn't going to be a good fit for the group, and not just because of his attitude. He had scoffed at their comic books, asked if they were babies when they talked about action figures, and when he'd said that baseball sounded fun, it made everyone shiver a little. He was large, a sneering boy, and they all decided to keep their distance from him as they said their goodbyes and pedaled away. But of course, Reggie lived on the block, so he inevitably found a place in their games. He was never invited, always just sort of invited himself. He made the teams uneven, and no one seemed to want him to play, but the boys were too polite to tell him to buzz off. That was how it started, but Josh and his friends had regretted giving in so easily almost at once. They'd been correct in their assumptions that he liked to hurt people. He had nearly broken Patrick's wrist when he fouled him during basketball. He had shoved Terry off his bike during a bike race, skinning both his hands and his knees. And every time he threw a football to you, you either caught it or you wound up with a bloody nose. By the end of the summer, their politeness had turned into fear, and they were all too afraid of him to tell him to go away when he came to invite himself to their games. They were playing baseball when it happened. Reggie had seen them setting up and inserted himself into the game, as he usually did. Terry sighed loudly, covering it up with a cough when Reggie got close enough to hear them. Josh and Terry had tried to explain that letting him play would make the teams uneven, but Reggie didn't really care. He made it pretty clear that he was going to play whether they liked it or not, and there wasn't really anything that could be done about it. Snarf had walked up then, snuffling Josh's hand for pats, and Josh had dropped to his knees to give him scratches. The dog accepted the attention, but his eyes never left Reggie, and Josh could see the mistrust in them. Reggie was the only person that Josh had ever seen elicit a growl from the usually good-natured dog. Reggie had quickly learned not to come into Josh's yard, as Snarf would not tolerate him. This was fine with Josh, because unlike the others, whose houses Reggie frequently visited, Snarf had kept him out of his yard and his fingers off of Josh's stuff. Josh was also careful to keep Snarf inside when he wasn't out there to supervise him. He had seen the way Reggie's piggy little eyes narrowed when he looked at the dog, and Josh knew enough to be cautious. He wished he'd just put Snarf inside when he started growling that day, but he had pushed it away and hoped it would help Reggie know that they wouldn't tolerate any funny business. The game had gone about as well as expected until the 5th inning. Reggie and Terry had been team captains, and Reggie had won the coin toss, so he got to pick first. Reggie and Walt had been on a team, and Terry and Josh had been on another, with Patrick acting as an umpire or standing in if someone got tired. Reggie had belted a few down the road, and he and Walt were winning 7-3. The trade-off for Reggie's freakish strength was that he wasn't particularly coordinated. He missed a few fly balls and let a few slide between his legs, so Josh and Terry weren't as far behind as they could have been. There had been some good-natured shoving, as good-natured as it ever got with Reggie, but there was no real violence to speak of. Snarf had gone to lounge on his lawn, and the boys were actually having fun, despite 4 of them having to keep an eye on the 5th. It all went south when Reggie took the plate again. He cracked it a good one, and Josh and Terry prepared to get out of the way as Reggie ran. Reggie did not believe in dropping the bat after hitting the ball, as the bruises on the boy's ankles could attest. The bat made a loud crack as it hit the ball, and as it sailed off down the street, Josh made a dash for it. Reggie came running around first base. Terry hovering between second and third, as Patrick stood on the manhole that was serving as the pitcher's mound. Patrick had quickly figured out that a third might be required when the teams took the field, and had agreed to be the pitcher and the umpire. Walt was whistling as Reggie ran for second, and the ball bounced once before Josh grabbed it. He had turned to throw it when he heard Terry yell out in pain. Terry, Walt would later tell him, had tripped Reggie as he ran past, and the big boy had fallen and skinned his hands and knees. Reggie had come up mad, cracking him in the stomach with the bat, and towering over him as the fallen boy prepared to have his skull caved in. Josh dropped the ball, sprinting towards the pair, as Reggie lifted the bat up to hit Terry again. Walt ran from the sidelines as Patrick came shouting and telling Reggie to knock it off. All three of them knew they wouldn't make it before he hit Terry, and they were just hoping to get there before he hit him again. Fast as they were, though, Snarf was faster. Snarf hit Reggie in the back, sending him reeling forward and dropping him into the street a second time. He stood over Terry protectively, snarling and showing his teeth at Reggie's back. Reggie was getting back up, shaking his head, but Snarf didn't seem to want to attack him. He just stood over Terry, the boy still frozen in surprise and fear. Reggie got back on his feet, his knuckles turning white against the bat's handle as he squeezed. Josh saw him turn in slow motion, the boy still running for Terry, but it made no difference. Snarf was staring daggers at Reggie, but when Josh called his name, he looked towards him, tail wagging. The bat crashed down on the dog, and the pitiful noise he made sent a shard of glass through Josh's guts. Walt and Patrick arrived in time to grab Terry under the arms and drag him away from the scene. Josh hit Reggie as hard as he could around the waist, dropping him to the concrete a third time and sending the bat clinking across the asphalt with an angry wooden clitter. Reggie hit his head on the concrete, and as the wind oofed out of him, Josh punched him in the face. He saw Reggie's eyes glaze a little with the impact, his lips quivering in surprise as his head bounced off the pavement again. Josh got off him, picking up the bat as Reggie tried to get his bearings. Josh pointed the bat at Reggie, yelling at him to get out of here. He told him not to come near him, his friends, or his dog again. He said some of the adult words he knew, the cusses sounding high and whispery as he fought back tears. Reggie got up on an elbow, grinning at Josh as he seemed to dare him to do anything. When the other three boys came up behind him, though, Reggie realized that he might be in trouble if he decided to act in haste. He could take one kid, bat or no bat, but 4 kids would probably beat the tar out of him. So, he backed up on his hands before breaking into a run and fleeing for home. Josh would never feel bad about what he had done to Reggie, but looking back at that moment, he would feel a lot of shame. The shame came from letting his anger blind him to Snarf's pain, from letting his need to dispel Reggie separate him from his dog when he needed him most. It didn't matter, though. None of it really mattered. When Josh turned back around, it was already too late. Josh found himself glaring at Reggie's old house as he watched a pair of Transformers walk off with their chocolate. The house was occupied now, but it had been empty for quite some time after the family had moved away. That had happened later, months after he'd killed Snarf, and those months felt like an eternity at the time. Reggie's parents had refused to believe that their son had killed Snarf, and they seemed angrier that Josh and his friends had beaten up their son. When they threatened to call the police, after Reggie had come home with scrapes and bruises, Josh's mom had just dropped the whole thing. Reggie's parents are threatening to sue us for hospital costs, and I can't afford something like that, sweetie. I'm sorry about Snarf, but if we call the cops, we'll be in trouble as well. She told Josh this, and he had seethed in his 10-year-old heart. He saw a big blonde kid with a crew cut, dressed in a karate gi, and he almost didn't hand him anything. Reggie was still on his mind, and this kid could have passed for him once upon a time. His eyes, they didn't really have that evil gleam in them, though, and Josh smiled at him as he handed him some candy. The kid threw him a mock salute and rejoined the throng still parading up the street. Reggie had been bigger, meaner, but in the end, Reggie had not been braver. Josh had been inconsolable after the death of Snarf. He had pretended to be sick for a week, and his mother had just let him pretend in the wake of his sorrow. His grandma stayed with him, often just sitting with Josh while he wallowed in his misery. She never pushed him as he moped around the house, just letting him feel his hurt as she waited for it to pass. He mostly just lay on the couch and watched TV, not really paying attention, just liking the noise. As they sat there one afternoon, her arm draped around him, she told Josh something he would never forget. "I know you miss your friend, but you can't let his death be the end of your life. You have to live it for both of you now. It's what he would have wanted." Josh looked up at her with big, swimmy eyes. But I miss him." She smiled. "I know you do, but it's almost Halloween, a time when they say the ghosts of our loved ones can walk the earth again. Maybe, just maybe, his love will be great enough to bring him back to you." That made him think. If ghosts and spirits could walk the earth on Halloween, then maybe Snarf could too. Josh spent the rest of the month in a little better mood, waiting for Halloween night so he could see if Snarf would come and visit. His mom had to work on Halloween, but Grandma was home with him and said that she could take him out trick-or-treating if he wanted. Josh didn't want to go out, though. He sat in his room and watched out the window, hoping to see Snarf as he ran up the front walk. When his friends came to see him, they were all costumed and looking for him to join their group. They begged him to trick-or-treat with them. They hadn't seen him in months. He hadn't come out to play since the baseball game, and they missed him. Each of them was dressed as a different Power Ranger, and Terry said his grandma had sent him a second costume if Josh wanted to use it. Josh had a feeling that Terry had bought it in case he decided to come out with them, and though touched, Josh still didn't want to go. He might miss Snarf, and he wanted to see him if he came back. Once again, Grandma had the answer. "I'll keep an eye out for him, and I'll tell him to stay if he comes to see you while you're gone." Josh was hesitant, but after some coaxing, he put on the costume and left with his group of friends. They had made him the Blue Ranger, his favorite Power Ranger, and as they set out into the night, he felt a little better. Josh had missed his friends over the past few weeks, but after what had happened, he just couldn't bring himself to see them. Going out with him now made him feel a lot better, and they spent a few blissful hours filling their sacks with candy. It would have been a perfect Halloween if Reggie hadn't come. Josh started noticing lights going out in the cul-de-sac as it ticked closer to 10. The kids who were present were becoming older, the little kids already turning in, and he furrowed his brow as Snarf still hadn't appeared. He felt like he had on that first Halloween after Snarf's death, looking for him as he'd walked the streets, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. Josh heard a bark and snapped his head to the side expectantly. He frowned, though, when he saw it was just a lab in a bee costume. Its owner came hurrying after him, followed by a football player heading for the next house. A pair of ninjas wandered up next, and Josh sighed as he dug them out some candy. Surely he wouldn't stand him up. He hadn't stood him up that night, so why start now? It was almost 10 by the time the lights started going out on that long-ago Halloween. The street began to empty, and Josh's bag was beginning to get heavy. He and his friends had bulging sacks of candy, and they were sitting on the sidewalk and trading. Josh had started out looking for Snarf, glancing around as they walked against the tide of excited children. In those 2 hours, he had gotten a reprieve from his sadness, but as the night wound down, the old feelings were starting to fester again. He told his friends that he had to get home, and Josh started looking for him again as he moved through the thinning group of trick-or-treaters. He wanted to get home so he could see if Snarf had come back, which was probably why he missed Reggie. When the egg hit him in the side of the head, Josh staggered under the impact. His ear rang, and he thought he was bleeding when his gloved hand came away wet. One look told him it was just egg yolk, though. He looked across the street and saw Reggie grinning at him from under a lamppost. He wasn't in costume, dressed in his baseball shorts and a tank top, but he did have a silver bat in his hand, tossing an egg up and catching it in his other as he smiled. Josh froze when he saw that he was staring at him, realizing how vulnerable he was out here alone with his house 3 streetlights away. "Been waiting for you to come out. We got unfinished business, Four Eyes. I think I owe you the same sort of beating I gave your stupid dog," he chuckled, swinging the bat experimentally. Josh stepped off the curve towards him, angry at what he had said, but thought better of it immediately. That metal bat could cave his skull in, and Reggie was pretty good at swinging bats. He glanced towards his house instead. 3 streetlights didn't seem so far, and Josh thought he could probably run faster than Reggie if it came to it. It seemed it was either run or sit here and get killed by this psycho. The choice seemed pretty obvious. He made the first light, easily outstriping Reggie, but Josh heard him getting closer as he moved under the second light. Reggie slapped the light pole with the bat as he went by, and it made a hollow thunk sound as it connected. Josh started to panic when he heard it. What if he caught him? What if he killed him? Would he die in the street like Snarf had? Josh wished that Snarf was here as his tears streamed down his face. He would have protected him. Snarf would have stopped Reggie from hurting him. If Josh hadn't distracted him that day, maybe Snarf would be here to help him. His house was in sight when the second egg cracked him in the back of the head. He stumbled as the egg connected. Josh had forgotten about the eggs. Though it hadn't been thrown very hard, it surprised him. Josh staggered into the fence that separated his yard from the neighbor's and crashed against it with a loud thunk. His head connected with the boards as he fell, and his head swam a little as the cheap plastic mask broke into pieces. Josh was reaching out in slow motion, moving his hands and legs like someone wading through mud. He rolled onto his butt as he prepared to take off again, but it was too late. Reggie loomed over him, the streetlight gleaming off his bat. "Looks like I caught you, Four Eyes," Reggie said, raising the bat. "Say hi to your dog for me when you see him." Josh pushed up against the fence, hoping it would fall backwards, knowing it wasn't going anywhere. Reggie raised the bat high, the metal twinkling as the light made galaxies of starbursts. Josh closed his eyes, preparing for the blow that would end his life prematurely. When the growl split the night, though, he opened his eyes and looked between Reggie's splayed legs. Reggie had turned his head to look at the shadowy crevice between the house and the fence that now stopped Josh from escaping. Between the structures stood a snarling, red-eyed creature that seemed to fill the space with its shadowy mass. Reggie took a sidelong step away from Josh, the beast snarling hugely as it took a single thunderous step towards him. Josh felt his breath hitch as Reggie stepped into the street, and the looming thing lowered its head and rumbled. Josh's brain couldn't fathom it. This nightmare creature had appeared in his neighborhood out of nowhere, and was now seconds away from ending both him and his bully. When it loosed that single ear-splitting snarl, Josh put his head between his knees and pushed his palms against his ears. He sat in the darkness, screaming against his legs as he prepared to be devoured. Josh had assumed that he would die that night, after running from the hulking brute, but never like this. When the warm tongue slid over his hair, he cracked the back of his head against the fence, trying to escape again. Then he opened his eyes, gasping like a trapped animal, to find Snarf's panting, grinning face. Reggie was gone, Bat lying in the street, and Josh wrapped his arms around his lost friend. He laughed as Snarf licked his cheek. He pressed his face against the dog's familiar short fur, and Josh's sadness melted away as Snarf's doggy tongue bombarded him. That was how his mom had found him, laughing with his back against the fence as her headlights dissipated the ghostly dog licking him as he'd done so many times before. Snarf had come back and visited him on Halloween night every year since. His mother didn't come right out and say it at first. She was upset about his injuries, but she told Josh later that she had seen Snarf for a few seconds before her headlights hit him. After he told her what had happened with Reggie, she called the police. She gave them the bat, told them how Reggie had been a problem this summer, and started a process of having a restraining order placed against him. She was tired of being bullied by Reggie's parents, as tired as Josh was of being bullied by Reggie. Reggie's family moved shortly before the order was finalized. Josh never saw him again, and was happier for it. Josh watched his mother walk up the front lawn now, Lily in her arms as she sleepily held on to her sack of candy. She was stumbling on the way back. "I think we're going to have some cocoa, if you'd like to join us." "Give me a few more minutes, Mom. I think he's just running late this year." Mom smiled. "Take all the time you need, dear." She walked inside, leaving him on the stoop. The street was emptying, only a few stragglers heading for home, and Josh glanced around furtively. Where was Snarf? Had he forgotten about his old friend? 20 years was a long time to visit someone who wasn't a little boy anymore. Maybe he had... Josh dropped the bowl of candy when that ghostly cold nose prodded his hand. He looked down to find Snarf, tail wagging, as he smiled up at him from the front lawn of the house he had loved so much. Josh wrapped his arms around him, and it felt like coming home again. Sounds like the rain's gone. I think that'll just about do it for us today. I hope you've enjoyed the cozy time we've spent together, and I know I'll be looking forward to our next adventure and our next bunch of stories. Until then, this is Dr. Plague, wishing you a wonderful day and a spooky evening.